Hi, I'm Jacqueline Morose from Succeed Together's Montclair Literary Festival. Thank you for joining us for today's festival. We have a great lineup, so I hope you'll join us for more of our terrific events today. The festival benefits Succeed Together, which provides free educational services to low-income children. If you'd like to support the tutoring and enrichment programming, you can donate via the link in the chat. Today's books are available for purchase through festival partner Watchung Booksellers. You can click on the green button on the bottom of your screen to purchase them. All our authors appear for free, so please thank them by buying their books. If you have a question for today's speakers, you can click on the Ask a Question bar on the bottom right of your screen. I'm happy to welcome Matthew Futterman, Deputy Sports Editor and Writer for the New York Times. He is the best-selling author of Running to the Edge, A Band of Misfits, and The Guru Who Unlocked the Secrets of Speed, and Players, How Sports Became a Business. He has covered the past 5 Olympics, World Cups, and numerous other major international sports events. In his spare time, he runs marathons, 25 and counting, including one this morning before he came on today. So welcome, Matt.
Thanks, Jackie. Thanks for having me. Thank you to everybody in Montclair for putting on this incredible event. So we have some great guests today for this panel. The first guest there is Ben Cohen, who I worked with for years at the Wall Street Journal. He is the author of The Hot Hand, which is one of the great big think sports books that I've ever read. Our other guest is Ben Reiter, who is a very aptly named writer, of course. We all wish we had that name in the business. And Ben is a writer that I've been envious of his talent for ages. I've read his byline forever at Sports Illustrated. I've done other events with him. His book Astroball was just absolutely terrific. He is best known for predicting in 2013 that the Astros would win the World Series in 2017, and lo and behold, they did. So welcome, guys. How's your pandemic going, Ben?
Well, I didn't run a marathon this morning, Matt, but it's been going okay. I've been busy. Obviously, since I wrote Astroball, the Astro story's taken a bit of an unexpected turn for me and for a lot of people in baseball.
Oh, really? Tell us, did something happen with the Astros?
Well, the subtitle of my book is The New Way to Win It All. And it turned out that part of the new way to win it all might have involved a little bit of the oldest way, which is cheating. Some of the people in the audience might have followed this story that the Astros have been penalized for illegal sign stealing, including in the 2017 World Series season that kind of represented the culmination of a lot of the efforts and the rebuilding effort that I write about in the book. So this has put an interesting twist on the story for sure. It's always been a story that I thought people could learn from. Now I think you can learn from the fact that a lot of their pushing to the edge of what's possible in baseball might have gone too far. So I've spent a lot of the pandemic, in fact, the last 6 months or so, working on what's going to be a 6-part narrative podcast, diving into this next chapter, really, of the Astros story. But thanks for asking. That'll come out in about a month, so keep an eye out for that.
So I'm curious, was it I mean, you obviously, everyone wanted to know what you thought of all this, and you had all these sources that helped you with the book. Did these sources, when you followed up with them, did they just run for the hills? Did anybody talk to you? Because I think a lot of people don't realize that Astroball was not, this was not a Houston Astros production, Astroball. It
Right.
was you. I mean, they didn't want to cooperate with you on this book. The last thing that executives in sports want to do is open the kimono, as people say, probably in a very politically incorrect way.
Right.
that I'll get in trouble for right now. But that's the last thing that they want to do, and so you had to sort of get them to tell you and get other people to tell you what was going on and how they built this franchise and how they went from not only the worst team in baseball, but a team in baseball that was just completely rudderless, with no future, with no farm system, to within 4 years being, well, maybe the best team in baseball. Let's say one of the better teams in baseball with some pretty talented players. And so after the cheating story broke, did anybody talk to you, or will anybody talk to you?
Yes, so that's a good thing for the podcast. It has been a challenge to get some people on the record, some people I know very well. But look, this was not just a bad team in the early part of the 2010s. This was the worst baseball team in 50 years by a lot of measures, right? Like, they're the worst team. Some people might remember on this chat the expansion New York Mets, who were, lovable losers and, the worst team that anybody could remember until the Houston Astros. They were as bad as those Mets. That's when I wrote my first SI story about them in 2014, in which I embedded with them for several days. I was able to negotiate this kind of unusual access to what are usually very secretive front offices. And I was obviously impressed by their plan. This was way beyond Moneyball. This was integrating, a very advanced analytics department with an old-fashioned scouting department to kind of get the best out of both new and old techniques as far as every decision they made, whether it's selecting players, training players, making trades, everything. So that's why I predicted on the cover of Sports Illustrated that it would actually work in a shorter period of time than people thought. And it did work. And I think that there's a lot to learn from the Astros process, how to use data properly, how to, push the edge of what is possible. I really do think that, and it's not everybody in the organization who went too far. That's one of the things I'm investigating, like who actually did what, who knew about what, how much is the culture of the place responsible for this, and how much are individuals making decisions responsible for this. I think that in their quest to push the envelope as far as they could go in baseball, they went too far. Now, to answer your question, will people talk about it? A lot of people are obviously very disincentivized to talk about this because it is the biggest baseball scandal. Depending on how you count, in a couple of decades in steroids, some people say it's the biggest baseball scandal ever. But, that only adds to the challenge of what I'm trying to do now. Great.
So Ben Cohen, turning to you, a completely different book. I like to think about sports books. There's sort of three categories of sports books. One is a biography of either a team or a player, which I would say Ben Reiter's book fits into. The other is, a great event, the 1975 World Series, and you sort of write a bit, the just soup to nuts tale of a great event and explaining the significance of that event on sort of a broader palette. And then there is the really hard books to write, which is just sort of an idea book, a big idea, a big topic. And what's so hard about it is you have to sort of build a narrative around it. And that's what Ben's book, The Hot Hand, is. It is a narrative of the search to answer a question, which is, do streaks exist, or are they a figment of our imaginations? And, it's the sort of thing that we could sit around anybody's living room back when we were allowed to sit around people's living rooms and debate this forever. But then there was actual data, and there's actual people who have dedicated their lives to this question. And Ben makes these people come alive in a way that is rather astounding. So Ben, I'm curious, how did you first get the idea that, yes, of all the topics in the world, of all the people that I could write about, I want to write about the search for truth in streaks?
Well, I think it actually started the way a lot of books start. And I think all three of our books started, which is that it started with a story in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago. And I think you guys know usually what happens when you think of a story and report the story and write the story and then eventually publish the story is that by the time anyone else reads it, you're just completely sick of it and you don't want to think about it anymore. The opposite kind of happened with The Hot Hand. I couldn't get it out of my head. It was this really seductive phenomenon. And what appealed to me was this built-in narrative, this saga over the course of 40 years to figure out whether we should believe what we see and feel. And it was a story in which the stars were Nobel Prize winners and, some of the greatest players who have ever graced the NBA. And really what appealed to me, this idea of streaks and this concept of the hot hand is something that we all feel to be true, only to be told that it wasn't true, only to realize that maybe it actually was, and maybe our intuition about this was right all along. And so the whiplash of that narrative just was sort of irresistible to me. And so that's kind of where it started. And then it led in, just all types of directions, many of which I just could never have imagined or anticipated.
When you came to this book, were you a believer in streaks?
I was, because I think that all of us are. I mean, I think that's really, part of the power of this phenomenon. In fact, the first paper that was published about the hot hand was published in 1985 by some of the smartest people on the planet. Three guys named Tom Gilovich, Bob Ballone, and the great Amos Tversky, who I think many of us now know as Kahneman and Tversky fame, the two psychologists who Michael Lewis wrote about a few years ago. And part of what made that paper so famous was the really counterintuitive conclusion that there is no such thing as the hot hand. It is simply a figment of our imagination. It's misreading patterns in randomness. But part of that paper was a survey of NBA players and recreational basketball players. And they asked, do you believe in the hot hand? And more important, do you think it's important to behave as if you believe in the hot hand? Which is to say, should you give the ball to somebody if they've made a few shots in a row? And what all of them, basically to a man said was, of course there's such a thing as the hot hand. We all have these experiences that linger with us for a very long time. And the funny thing about this is that paper was published, 35 years ago now. And for that entire time, even though some of the smartest people on the planet had told us there was no such thing as the hot hand, if you walked into any NBA locker room, as all of us have, and if you asked a player, do you believe in the hot hand? All of them, to a man, still would say, of course I believe in the hot hand. Like, you'd be crazy not to. And so that dissonance was really appealing to me.
And you said you believed in it when you started to explore the topic. Did you go in waves as you were researching the book where I believe in it, actually I don't believe in it, well, wait a minute, it's true? Yeah,
of course. And I think that's sort of like that, the subtitle of this book is The Mystery and the Science of Streaks. And I think that's sort of the mystery of it, because really whether or not you should believe in the hot hand depends on what you are doing and what field you are in and whether or not you have control of what you're doing. But, Matt, I should also say, part of the reason I believed in the hot hand was because I'd felt it myself, just like I think all of us do. I was a really pathetic high school basketball player, and that's not like understating it. Really bad, like a truly horrific basketball player. But in one quarter of one game, I scored more points than I had in my entire career combined. And nobody else has any reason to remember that game. There were probably like 6 people in the stands, but that game has stuck with me forever. And I think all of us have feelings like that, whether it's in some junior varsity basketball game that nobody else remembers, or whether it's, the three of us sitting at our keyboards when the words just pour out. Or Matt, I mean, you wrote a book about running and a coach who really inspired his runners to do things that they really never thought possible. And I'm sure, I mean, you ran a marathon this morning. I'm sure that you can remember very clearly, like the hottest, runs that you've ever had, whatever you call that, whether it's a runner's high or getting in the flow. There are days when everything clicks for reasons that you don't really understand, but you also can't really ever forget.
That is true. You do. I guess my thought is it's always sort of explainable. In retrospect, I can always sort of like explain, or I always feel like I can explain it. Well, I slept pretty well, or I actually ate pretty well last night. I didn't have a second beer. I didn't, there's all these sort of things that you can sort of put together. I'm not sure whether they're true or not.
But you can't predict it, right? And that's the most important thing.
It is incredibly difficult to predict. Now, Ben Reiter, since Ben Cohen told us about his sports exploits, let's just get a window into your athletic career, since all sports writers are in fact frustrated athletes.
I'm sorry, Ben. I'm sorry for bringing this up.
No,
I should say before we go any further, just so our audience knows, we are talking to the heart and soul, the pride of Essex County here. We have one product of Columbia High School, another product of Livingston, New Jersey, Newark Academy graduate, where my wife went as well. So this is if you want to support Essex County, go buy dozens of these books for your children and show them what they can be when they grow up.
Yeah, I'm the Columbia High School graduate. Columbia in Maplewood. I grew up in South Orange, although my parents now actually live in Montclair. I was a tennis player in high school, doubles player. So, but yeah, I'm sure that did inspire my future career. One thing that I think Ben sees on this as well, and I know he does not just in his book, but in his writing in the Wall Street Journal, is that sports is just such a great way to explain all sorts of other stories. It's like a wonderful prism through which to tell all kinds of stories. And you know this too, Matt. So the Astros one is in itself like, oh, it's a great underdog story. The worst team in 50 years, as I said, in 3 years becomes the best team in the league. How'd that happen? But it really has a resonance that goes far beyond sports as far as how to properly use data to turn out an organization. Really what the Astros were doing was similar to what Ben was doing in his book. Like they were trying to uncover deeper truths about how the world worked, deeper truths that contributed to great performance. They were trying to, we live life largely by rules of thumb and anecdotal evidence, right? And they were trying to say, well, what's the truth behind these things? Like, for example, the concept of team chemistry, when Ben was talking about the history of the hot hand, the idea of team chemistry having an impact on success is one that's been deeply debated. And in fact, a lot of early analysts threw it out. They said, you know what? Just like they did with the hot hand. They said, you know what? There actually is no such thing as team chemistry. Whether the guys get along well or not has no actual impact on winning. In the Astros case, they did a little work on this, but it was almost like an intuitive thing. They said, you know what? Like, it's very hard to quantify this, but we believe in this. We, in fact, believe that team chemistry could be the last thing that separates a very good team from a championship team. So they invested in it. Now, obviously, that team chemistry, and I hate not to have what happened next hang over every topic, but obviously the particular chemistry of their team led them to some places that were not as positive as far as the sign stealing. But it all kind of stems from this philosophy that they had, and that in most ways, not always, but in most ways, led them to great success.
Do you think they win the World Series in 2017 without the sign stealing?
That's one of the tragedies of the scandal, is that we don't know, right? Like, you talk to everybody, or you talk to most impartial observers or outside analysts, and they'll say this team was one of the best teams in the league, no matter what they were doing. They're saying if their sign stealing added anything to their bottom line, it might have been a couple of percentage points, right? Like, in the grand scheme of things. However, that's not really how baseball works. Like, you have to remember that they won the championship in a 7-game series against another really, really good team, the Los Angeles Dodgers. So any one pitch that ended up differently, any one outcome that ended up differently, could have actually made the difference between them winning and losing the World Series. So you can't go back and play counterfactuals and say, oh, if they hadn't done this, they would have or wouldn't have. They would have been in the running, but we'll never know if they had not done this, if they would have still actually won the World Series or just been a World Series caliber team.
Because they were not able to do this on the road, correct?
They were not.
They were not able to do had the whole system in place on the road, and it's very strange. What struck me as very strange about this whole scandal is that they were not able to do it on the road, and a lot of the players performed better on the road. So not only it struck me as not only were they cheating, but they were kind of bad at cheating.
Not to give too much away, but
they may have worked out some other systems on the road.
They may have been doing some other things. They may not have been alone in baseball of doing other things. And if you talk to certain people who have dug very deeply into their trash can banging scheme, which is what everybody kind of hangs on to for good reason, there are some analyses that suggest that at the end of the day, it actually added nothing at all to their bottom line production, which is a great irony of this thing. And there are a bunch of caveats there, such as like, that's the bottom line, right? Like if it added something to like a key at bat that gave them a key win or whatever, like that could change the entire outcome of the season. But to answer your question, no, it looks like the system that they primarily used probably didn't benefit them that much. And especially now that they were caught and have been disgraced, probably hurt them a lot. Although, of course, they're not giving back their World Series ring, so they still have that.
Right.
Well, it's funny, Ben, because the best teams in sports now are just incredibly ruthless, right? We know this from the NFL to the NBA to baseball, but serendipity plays such an important factor, and luck too. I mean, sometimes just pure randomness and chance. So the first chapter in my book is about one game that Steph Curry had 7 years ago, not too far away in Madison Square Garden. But, the only way to watch good basketball in Madison Square Garden these days is to watch the team that is playing against the Knicks. But back then, the Golden State Warriors were not very good. And, it sounds kind of crazy to say this now, but neither was Steph Curry. And that day when he woke up, it had been a really miserable day for him. He had gotten into a fight the night before. He woke up $35,000 poorer after being fined by the NBA. He missed the bus that he usually takes to the team arena. He usually takes the second bus. He hops on the third bus instead. The third bus pulls onto 7th Avenue and gets pulled over by New York City traffic cops on the way to Madison Square Garden. So he's late. He's rushed. He's probably in a pretty foul mood after waking up, losing just an incredible amount of money. And yet that night, he scores 54 points, which is the most points he's still scored in a basketball game to this day. He made 11 of his 13 three-pointers. He did things that nobody in the history of basketball had ever done. And, the Golden State Warriors are really smart and really innovative. And in the time since then, they've kind of changed the way that basketball is played on just about every level, no matter where in the world you are. But whether or not they would have embraced that strategy, I'm not sure that happens if Steph Curry just doesn't catch fire and go completely bananas for one game in Madison Square Garden. That was a game that it changed his life for sure, but it also changed the fate of the Warriors and the future of the whole NBA. And, sometimes you just need things to break your way a little bit, even at that highest level, and maybe especially at that highest level of sports.
Now, and then you talk about things breaking your way in your book. But it's not necessary. But you go far beyond sports in your book, and I'm curious. I mean, you spent some time at a sugar beet farm in North Dakota to talk about how the hot hand could influence sugar beet farming. You talk about one of the great mysteries of the Cold War, and and trying to find one of the most famous rescuers of Holocaust victims. Why did you want to go beyond sports to talk about this topic? And do you think it influenced it? And can you explain a little bit of how a streak would affect a sugar beet farmer?
Sure. Really, the reason is because that is the reason why all of these really bright minds have studied the hot hand for 35 years. It's because they're not actually studying basketball. They are really studying how we make decisions and how the human mind works. Ben said something before, which I think I write almost verbatim in the book, which is that basketball and sports happens to be this really wonderful excuse to explore the rest of the world. There are lessons that apply sort of everywhere, and that is especially true in the hot hand. there have been hundreds of studies about this phenomenon over the last 4 decades, but the 3 major ones have all been rooted in basketball. And so this quest to sort of figure out how our mind works and whether we should believe our intuition really does have roots in sports. And it would have been just completely intellectually dishonest for me to not write about basketball. So that was this great excuse to write about basketball, but also write about things that just have nothing to do with basketball, such as Shakespeare's writing during plague years and how The Princess Bride, that amazing 80s movie got made. And, I got to go to a sugar beet farm on the border of Minnesota and North Dakota, which is, I have to say, something that growing up in Essex County, I did not expect to, ever be. But farming is a really interesting example of the hot hand because it's sort of the opposite of basketball. In basketball, if you're Steph Curry and you make a whole bunch of shots in a row, it's sort of in your control if you want to shoot again and if you think you're going to make your next shot. But in farming, the single most influential determinant of success in farming is something beyond your control. It's really the weather, and it's random. And it's the farmer that I visited out there, a guy named Nick Hagan, who is this really smart guy who believes in the hot hand in basketball, but not in farming, because what he says is that you have to really play defense in farming. If basketball is offense and the playing field is the same every time, it's like this beautiful rectangle. Farming, one day could be a rectangle, and one day it could be a triangle, and the next day it could be a rhombus, and you just never really know. So you have to play the long game and have to hope that the weather and things beyond your control are on your side. Because if you have 1 or 2 good years with soybeans and decide to invest everything in the next year's soybean crop, and it happens to be a bad year, if you bet the farm, you can lose everything. Whereas the risk for Steph Curry is missing 1 shot against the Knicks, and because of the Knicks, you're probably going to win that game anyway, right? So, so it's a little bit different, but in an interesting way, and that's sort of why I wanted to go out to a farm. So, it's not just about basketball; it's sort of about everything, including farming, which is, I really knew nothing. I have to say, I really knew nothing about it, and I still kind of know nothing about it. Which, it's sort of, I think, what basketball players think about sports journalists is that we really don't know anything about it, and we still don't know anything about it, but that was especially true here.
So I just want to remind the audience, if anyone wants to ask a question, there is a Ask a Question button on the lower right part of your screen, and you can click on that, and I will see your question, and I will make sure Ben and Ben get an opportunity to answer that question. So just throwing that out there. Now, I can wholeheartedly agree with your sugar beet farmer. This pandemic, I planted my first vegetable garden, and man, it was going great until that storm ran through in the middle of, what was it, late July or early August, and I lost like half my plants, and all I could think of was the sugar beet farmer in Ben's book. And I was like, yeah, this is what he was talking about. Like, you can do everything. You can work. I mean, I started planting it in March, and I was worked on it every day. I watered it. I did everything you were supposed to. And then really, it was like 2 bad hours of the cloud pattern not cooperating, and half the plants were wiped out. So I guess I was not hot, I guess my streak ran out because everything was going fine. Now, Ben Reiter, I'm curious, one of the main characters in your book obviously is Jeff Lunau, who was is he general manager or the president? I mean, not that his title managers, but he was the guru. He was a Houston Astros guru. He was a former McKinsey employee, and eventually found his way in the analytics department at the St. Louis Cardinals, and then was hired to remake the Houston Astros. Now, he has since been tossed out of baseball for a year for his role in this scandal. I imagine you have something. You have or have had something of a relationship with him. Full disclosure: Ben Cohen and I know him through his brother, David Lunau, who's the Mexico City bureau chief at the Wall Street Journal. So I'm curious what it was like for you to see the sort of arc of a character someone you got to know. I mean, I imagine you got to know him sort of when I got to know him, which was when he was with the Cardinals, because I think I covered that World Series, one of those World Series with you, and he was kind of around, and we would sort of chat with him in the bowels of Busch Stadium. And I'm sort of curious, what is it like to see a character like that, who you have a relationship with, sort of go from total obscurity to, the peak of fame, and then become really the symbol of, the things that were written about him this spring? I mean, you would think he was, the leader of the Taliban or something like that. I mean, it's really unbelievable. I mean, I know people take sports very seriously, and thank God they do, or else we wouldn't have jobs or wouldn't sell any books. But what was that like to see this happen to Jeff, who's a pretty mild-mannered guy, at least upon first impression?
He is very mild-mannered, and you're right. I'd been, reporting on him, like direct. I was aware of him before 2013, 2014, but it had been 6 years. I'd gotten to know Jeff Lunau as a source, and I guess what I'd say is when these revelations came out, a lot of people asked me, well, a lot of people on Twitter, especially, like, you knew about this, you were covering it up to me. And of course I didn't, because if I had known about this, I would have certainly written about it in the book that I wrote, and it would have been even more successful because of that, and it would have been truer to the story, more importantly. I did not know about it specifically, the sign stealing scandal, but I found myself not being entirely surprised by it, right? And I was thinking, why is that? And it was because I could understand, if you extrapolate it out, I could understand, given the culture of the organization, how things could have gone too far as they did. I think that Jeff Lunau has been really villainized here, right? I mean, he's the recent Mets sale, right, which is about to go through. Stephen A. Cohen, the Wall Street financier, who, by the way, his firm was assessed the largest fine in the history of the country for insider trading not so long ago. But he's on the verge of buying the Mets, and he has outbid a group led by Alex Rodriguez and Jennifer Lopez for the Mets. And the explanation publicly as to why he was selected was because the A-Rod group had consulted with Jeff Lunau, and this was such a negative thing that it put their group out of the running. That's how much of a villain he is seen as in baseball. And
I kind of think Steve Cohen was selected because he had the most money. As he offered the most money is probably the simplest explanation.
Well,
right?
I think you gave away my punchline a little bit, but yeah, it shows like what the real motivations are here, right? Ultimately, but yes, Lunau's been villainized. An interesting thing is that Major League Baseball, in its investigation of this cheating scandal, couldn't actually determine that Lunau knew about it. Right? Like, it's hard to believe the general manager wouldn't know about it, at least generally, but they interviewed 70 people. They seem to nail down every other detail. They can't just figure out if he knew about it. But what they said is that the culture that he had instituted in Houston was so toxic that they were punishing him for that anyway, and for not having kind of properly told his players and in the clubhouse about the new sign stealing rules that they then violated. I think the secret is that baseball as a whole is a lot more like the Astros were like 5 years ago than anybody'd want to admit. Kind of everybody is operating like the Astros now, which means treating baseball not as like a mom and pop kind of like community resource, but as a really big business. These teams are worth, Stevie Cohen's going to pay $2.5 billion for the Mets. So all of these things that some people object to about Wall Street and consulting and all these industries are now baked into the business of baseball.
So we have some questions from the audience.
Matt, can I ask Ben a question first? Can I jump
No,
the line?
I'm gonna go to the audience first because
We'll do one.
they're the people that are gonna buy your book. So
That's true. That's
and
true.
Save your question, Ben.
And this is a question. Save your question. We'll get to that. This is for Ben Cohen. When people have the hot hand, do they know it or are they in the zone?
Well, I think that's the same thing, right? I think that they do sort of sense something is happening. In fact, I figure there's really no better person to ask this question than the greatest shooter in the history of the planet. So I kind of asked Steph Curry about this, and I said, "Did you know that you were in the zone in that game that you say is the hottest game of your career? And was there any way to predict that you would be in the zone?" And of course, he knew that he was in the zone. In fact, once he sort of felt the hot hand. In fact, it happened on one specific shot after halftime. He was hot in the first half. He made his first shot in the second half, and he sort of realized he was still hot, and he was going to do everything in his power to keep shooting, regardless of what type of shot it was, whether it was a crazy shot, a risky shot, a longer shot. He was just going to shoot. But even more interesting is that he just had no way of predicting it. And what he says is that there's no way to know when it's going to happen or where or why or how it's going to happen. But once it does happen, you have to embrace it. And I think that's sort of the best way to think about this idea, at least in terms of basketball or sports, is that you just want to embrace it while you can, and you want to try not to get burned by it.
So there's another question for the audience. I'm going to answer it first because it'll give you guys about 10 or 12 seconds to think about it and think about your answer. So it says, the question is there a work of fiction that you regard as the quintessential American sports story? And I'm going to answer that by saying Casey at the Bat, which was that famous poem that I think I read when I was 6 years old or something like that. And I remember reading it, and I remember getting to the end and just being completely heartbroken that Casey struck out, like Mighty Casey had struck out. And I think I've never quite gotten over that, the Mudville Nine lost that day. So that to me is the quintessential American sports story. It sets you up for years of heartbreak, even if you are a fan of the Yankees or the Dallas Cowboys or any other machine that seems to win a lot, because essentially because there's going to be more losing than winning. What about
I thought you would go with Richard Ford,
the sports writer. Yeah, that's there. But I have to say, I reread the sports writer. I was rereading the middle. So Richard Ford wrote as a trilogy, the sports writer, Independence Day, and the third one is The Lay of the Land. Is the main character Frank Bascom is a former sports writer, and I reread Independence Day this year, which is long my favorite book, and it was the first time reading the book where I was older than the main character, and I suddenly had like a different perspective that he's not like this sort of knowing, thoughtful guy. He's kind of a jerk. So it was just an interesting perspective on it. But I do highly recommend those books. But what do you guys say? Quintessential work of American sports fiction.
Bit of a left field one for me, but I always come back to a book called A Fan's Notes by Frederick Exley. I think about it even more these days. It's almost like about how obsession can overtake somebody and fill a lot of other holes in their lives. The protagonist of this book in particular is obsessed with Frank Gifford of the New York Giants. But especially now when we're in an increasingly polarized society, and we don't have to get into all those things, but I find myself coming back to it now and thinking about, the role of sports in our society, and also, what we can learn about it, particularly the human behavior surrounding it, not just on the field, but in the entire kind of sports industrial ecosystem.
So we seem to, I don't know about your screen, but my screen seems to have lost Ben Cohen for a moment.
He's here for me.
He's here for you. Ben, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. I can't seem to see you for some reason.
I thought I was getting out of the question.
Okay. Oh, yeah, great. So I'm glad you're here. What is your answer?
Well, I was just looking over at my bookshelf, and, I don't know that I have a great answer. I feel like the last sports book that I read. I don't know that I would call it the quintessential sports novel, but The Art of Fielding came out like a decade ago, right? And that was like the last big sports novel. And I think it's just really hard to write sports fiction that's like really high quality and literary and the type of thing that endures for a long time. And probably baseball is the easiest, but like, is there a great basketball novel?
I don't know that there is, and it's also really hard to make sports movies because everybody's really bad at sports. So it's hard to make these people feel it. Although when I wrote my book, Running to the Edge, the model I had for it was a movie from the '80s called Breaking Away, which was a cycling movie about these guys from Bloomington, Indiana, who sort of come out of nowhere to beat the Italians in a cycling race. But so Ben, a couple more questions from the audience. Ben Reiter, let me get this one to you. But I guess Ben Cohen can also take a shot at it as well. Is any sport different from baseball in terms of integrity, in terms of sign stealing? I guess the question for both of you is everybody cheating in every sport?
Yes. And that's one of the things that I'm now investigating very deeply, is the concept of this line between gamesmanship and cheating. Who draws it? How does it move over time? How do we know when we've crossed it? And how do we deal with people who we judge to have crossed it, right? It was very interesting with the Astros in particular, how it seems very clear that they crossed a line. And yes, they broke a rule, but every team breaks rules. But it was very unusual the way that so many other players in the league were so furious about this and continue to be furious. Like, it's clear that the Astros were doing something different, even though baseball teams have been stealing signs since the first recorded instance of sign stealing was in 1876, the first year of the National League. And they've been doing it ever since then. Like Bob Feller, Hall of Fame pitcher, brought a telescope back from World War II and had it set up in the scoreboard in the Cleveland Stadium, and would have people communicate each pitch to the guys at home plate. This is something that's been part of the fabric of baseball forever. So one of the things I'm really interested in is why did what the Astros do cross the line so clearly, and also why are we so angry about it? Because I've never seen. I know it's hard to think of a situation in which the entire sports world, including people in the league, are so angry and so turned against one particular target with such unanimity.
I think it was so funny, the timing of that scandal, because it was such a big deal over the winter and people were so irate about it. And then COVID-19 happens, and all of a sudden it was like, oh yeah, I guess that wasn't that big a deal. I guess maybe we were. I guess we got a little too excited about that.
We have bigger problems,
right?
Sure.
Exactly. We have this really big problem here. Yeah. I mean, I would answer. I mean, it is. I mean, I like the way you put it. That there's this gray area that we'll never get our arms around on what exactly is an unfair advantage, and what encapsulates it for me. And I don't by any means want to suggest that there is sort of cheating involved in here, is the story of the situation with intersex athletes and Caster Semenya and running, and how these women who are born with elevated levels of testosterone, and now the World Athletics Organization has sort of passed this rules and got approval to pass these rules that says they have to take drugs in order to change who they are, in order to compete, as if they have this sort of unfair advantage. And there is science that suggests they do have an unfair advantage, but why is that considered an unfair advantage? Whereas, being born 8 feet tall, if you were 8 feet tall, you'd be a great basketball player, theoretically. That would not be considered an unfair advantage. It's a really, really difficult with basketball. How do people cheat in basketball other than James Harden taking 8 steps before he shoots the ball?
Well, what I was going to say is that there's an amazing irony in baseball, which is that there are some forms of sign stealing that are perfectly legal, and every player and team partake in. Like if you're just standing on second base, you can figure out a way to signal to the batter what pitch is coming if the catcher is not disguising his signals well enough, right? I mean, that has always been accepted. And in fact, if you watch the NBA playoffs tonight on television, every team knows exactly what the other team is running every time they come down the floor. Like if the playbooks are memorized, like there are no secrets, and that is part of what makes playoff series especially so rich, is that the first play gets taken away, and then the second and the third and the fourth, and eventually they're scrambling. But like when a coach calls out a play in basketball, especially now in the NBA bubble where there are no fans and the other team can hear exactly what he is saying, there's no secret, there's no mystery, right? Like part of basketball players steal signs during every game. Like that is part of the run of play on every possession. So there are clearly ways to sort of game the game. James Harden is spectacular at that. Like that is one of his great extraordinary superpowers, is finding ways to make refs call things that may or may not be fouls. But in terms of actually stealing signs or knowing what's coming or scouting the opponent, I mean, that's all accepted, and it's kind of accepted in baseball too. I mean, I think one of the questions that I'm sure Ben is thinking about a lot now is like, why not just say sign stealing is perfectly illegal? Any type of sign stealing, right? Like, should there be rules against that? I think it's sort of this interesting ethically gray area. Like teams already have advantages and do things that they never would have dreamed possible a decade ago. Like, what if you just start bringing spies into baseball teams? That would be an interesting little twist.
That would be a twist. I'm curious. I want to move to this other. We got a number of questions from the audience. I want to try and get to them.
Great.
Another question. How do you guys think a live crowd contributes to winning versus not having a crowd?
Well, I think there are like certainly behavioral issues at play. I mean, a lot of my book is about momentum, and I think we all know you can sort of feed off the momentum of a home crowd when everybody is going completely nuts around you, or there's like a real psychological pleasure in silencing 20,000 people at once, and that's something that we're not going to experience for a very long time in America. It feels like, which is really sad. I mean, we're seeing it in the NBA bubble. It's just weird, right? I don't think we really know how it affects the game yet, other than to just point out just the sheer oddity of it. Matt, you're going to the U.S. Open, like that. It must be like completely bizarre.
Yeah, I've been to the U.S. Open the last 2 weeks, and it's honestly just really sad. I mean, people ask me, "What's it like there? Is it cool?" I mean, the bottom line is it's just sad. I mean, that place is just a great party for 2 weeks, and been going there since I was a kid, and also professionally. So it's pretty sad, but. In terms of, I mean, you've seen just a tremendous amount of upsets at this tournament, and there's no question in my mind that not having a crowd has really helped the underdog in that.
Because if you're trying to beat Roger Federer, you're not just trying to beat Federer, you're trying to beat the crowd too.
Yeah, and it's not, and this is, this gets back to, the subject of your book, which is basically behavioral psychology, and there's a famous hypothesis about this, which has been largely proven. It's called the Zajanc hypothesis, which is that if something is easy to do, then having a crowd will make you do it better. But if something's really hard to do, having a crowd will make it much harder. It's easier for Roger Federer to beat the 150th player in the world in front of 50,000 people. But being the 150th best player in the world and going up against the number one player in the world to beat them is a hard thing. And so to pull that off in front of people is very, very difficult. One more question from the audience. There's several questions from the audience, and we're running out of time. We have about a minute and a half left. So quick question. How much does the team being profitable matter to success, or is it better to be an underdog? Ben Reiter.
Let's do lightning round here.
Yes.
It's better to be profitable, surprisingly.
Especially in baseball, right?
Especially in baseball, yeah.
Right. Ben Cohen, are there any sports where the hot hand never happens?
No. I mean, every sport, if something has been a sport, it's been picked over for evidence of the hot hand. And there might be studies showing there is no such thing as the hot hand, but I can guarantee you that if you've played that sport, you probably think that there is a hot hand.
Now, do you think, this is an interesting question. Do you guys think that being on a wealthy plush team makes players soft?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think there might be something to being an underdog once in a while, but I think unfortunately we're actually getting into an era, at least in sports without a salary cap, where money really matters again, right? Like the A's, the story of the A's were, exploiting inefficiencies, we're going to do things differently and be the underdogs. Like the rich teams are just as smart as the less rich teams now, but they have more money. So if you look at a sport like baseball, where it's the Dodgers, Yankees, the Astros for that matter. If you look at, soccer, where it's like, Manchester City and Liverpool, money, which I think is a real shame, is becoming kind of like the most determining factor as far as success in leagues that don't have a salary cap, which the NBA thankfully does and the NHL does and certain other sports.
Yeah, I should also say that if there's one thing that sports teams are good at, it's pretending that they are underdogs and manufacturing challenges that may not exist. So,
and also pretending they don't have money when they
right.
Another thing. Well, they have less money than they used to after this season, unfortunately. So we are out of time. I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to encourage everybody to buy Ben Reiter's book, Astroball, and listen to his updated version of that on his podcast when that comes out. I hope you also write a sequel to your book, because I will listen to the podcast, but there is nothing like just sitting in your living room and reading the book written by a great writer. And also Ben Cohen, who's the author of The Hot Hand, which is, like I said before, a story of a big idea, and I couldn't more highly recommend either of these books. Thank you guys so much.
You have to buy Matt's book as well, by the way. I
agree.
Pick it up immediately on the link at the bottom here.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And next year, we'll do this in real life, I hope.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
All right.
Are we off? Or is our mic still hot?
Thanks, guys. That was a lot of fun. Thanks for moderating, Matt. And Ben, you live half a block from me. I'm sure I'll see you on the street sometime.
I know. So I'll see you at like alternate side parking next week or something.
Are you the one that's like overlooking the AIDS memorial, that building?
Yeah, the one like right next to the hospital, right above Village Den.
Yeah, okay. Amazing. Like you're literally 1 minute.